We still have a pretty good full house, even with all the parents and kids gone. That's impressive. Well, I almost didn't have anything to say today. No, I'm serious. Usually Friday afternoon, I take my PowerPoint that's completed and I send it to the AV department and I send it to myself at my email so that I can review it on Friday night, because I always like to go through my notes and kind of think about what I'm going to say. So last night I opened up my iPad and I started looking at it, and there was only 4 slides. Now I have about 45 slides. And I went, oh, it must have gotten lost in transmission. So I texted Ken and I said, Ken, I'll get you the full version tomorrow. Obviously I sent you the version I sent you was truncated in sending it. So I come into my office kind of lazily this morning and open up my computer, and the file saved on my computer is the same one I sent to myself, only 4 slides. And now I'm in panic mode. And I start looking around to try to find my sermon, because the 4 slides were what I had finished Monday, and I worked on it all week, and by Friday afternoon I had a fully developed sermon that I didn't have, and I didn't know how I was going to reproduce that in 45 minutes. So I called Ken, and we're in my office, and I'm sweating bullets. I was just panicking. And we were looking everywhere and trying to find temporary files and saved files, and I don't know what we did, but suddenly 2 files popped up with the same name. One of them was the truncated version, and the other one was the one I had saved yesterday. Oh man, my shirt is just soaking wet. Because I was just going to stand up here and tell stories about Larry. He should be thankful that I have a sermon, because now I don't have to focus on him. Bring it, he says. Yeah, you don't want this. So I just want you to know I'm much better now than I was at 9:30. I was panicking at 9:30, thinking, I don't know what I was thinking. It wasn't good. So pray with me as we get started this morning. Gracious God, I want to thank you for helping me find my sermon this morning and helping me prepare it. And Lord, I just pray that I could present it in the way that it sort of flowed when I was producing it. Give me the words and give us the ears to listen. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if you don't know by now, we're in a sermon series, and we're at the 5th step. And today, or this week, in preparing for this one, I recognized how significant it is, the steps to get us here. And I think by the time I'm done with my sermon, you might also notice the significance of these building block steps. Because when you get to this step, if you don't have the previous ones, you will fail. You will collapse. I guarantee it. So we're going to talk about perseverance. Well, what's a definition? It commonly suggests activity maintained in spite of difficulties or steadfast and long-continued application. Endurance and perseverance combine to win in the end. It is regularly used in a favorable sense. Now, how many of you ever persevered through a vacation? If it was a good vacation, could you say you were persevering? Or maybe you were having a wonderful meal with friends and enjoyable conversation. Can you say you were persevering through that? Persevering does carry the connotation of difficulty, unpleasantness. And keep that in the back of your mind, because we don't persevere through good times. We persevere through difficulty. Persistence is a synonym. It may be used either favorably or unfavorably. It implies unremitting and sometimes annoying perseverance. So it could be a negative context or a positive for this one. And then we have tenacity. Originally, the meaning of tenacity was like adhesiveness in glue. It is a dogged and determined holding on, whether used literally or figuratively. It has favorable implications. A bulldog quality of tenacity, or the tenacity of one's memory. It's important to have these definitions, because as I get into the sermon, as I get into my illustration, and my illustration is what pulled this all together for me, you may have a different perspective on perseverance as a Christian. The Greek word used in the New Testament, hupomene, means a cheerful or hopeful endurance, a constancy, enduring patience, patient continuance, or waiting. So this word is used 14 times in the New Testament. There are 14 biblical texts, and there are a couple of extra texts that are words similar to, but I took the primary word, and there's a couple of other words, but this is the primary word in the New Testament, and I'm not going to share all 14 texts. It gets repetitive and gets boring, but I want to share a few. The first one is found in Romans 8, 22 to 25. And it says, "For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first the fruits of the spirits, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what is already seen? But if we hope for what we do not see with perseverance, we wait eagerly for it." There is a common theme throughout the New Testament, and that is the perseverance or the hope in the second coming of Jesus. This was a constant theme amongst the Jews before the first coming of Jesus, the waiting for the Messiah. Every generation, every young mother wondered if she was going to be the mother of the Messiah. Constantly, one of the themes at the Passover, in fact, I had a classmate in seminary, very talented musician, a young woman. She wrote a song because in Israel there is a statement at the Passover. When Passover ends, the belief in Israel was that the Messiah would come at the Passover. And so when the Messiah didn't come, they would always say, "Next year in Jerusalem." Constantly repeated at the end of Passover. And so this classmate of mine wrote a song and titled it "Next Year in Jerusalem." Only she wasn't writing it in the context of the first coming, but the second coming of Jesus. So with perseverance, we wait eagerly for the hope of the culmination of this thing we call the plan of salvation. 2 Thessalonians 1:4 also uses the word, "We ought always to give thanks to God for you, brethren, as is only fitting, because your faith is greatly enlarged, and the love of each one of you toward one another grows even greater. Therefore we ourselves speak proudly of you among the churches of God for your perseverance and faith in the midst of your persecutions and afflictions which you endure." You see the connection between endurance or perseverance and persecution or affliction? If we look through the history of the Christian world, if we go back to the first century, we see some pretty difficult times in Christianity. Did the saints of those times have to endure? Did they have to persevere? Did they have to go through some periods of being difficult to be a Christian? They did, didn't they? Through every generation. Even today in some parts of the world. Now, we don't have a lot to persevere on, do we? It's not like we're in Iraq or Saudi Arabia where Christianity is illegal, where you could be disemboweled by people just because you say you're a Christian. So we look at some of these people in other parts of the country or other parts of the world and we say, well, they have to persevere. But these texts are for Christians of all time, that there is a perseverance. What does that tell you? It tells me that being a Christian isn't always fun. It isn't always easy. It isn't always about lollipops and sugar plums and candy canes. That there is times that as Christians we persevere. Sometimes we persevere through our own faith struggles. We doubt. We fear. Sometimes we persevere through others who are attacking us. They are ridiculing us. We persevere. And there are times in our desperate moments where we say, Lord, why haven't you come yet? we persevere as we wait for the coming of Jesus. 1 Timothy 6:11, but flee from those things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. Paul uses the term a lot. I wonder if Paul had any experience in perseverance. You think? Do you think this was on his mind because Paul was constantly being attacked, ridiculed, stoned, whipped, kicked out of town, thrown in prison? And what did he do? He got up and he kept going. If there is a Christian model of perseverance, you've got to say Paul is at least one of them. Could we say John the Revelator was also a model of perseverance? Do you know what John endured? Do you know that John was boiled in oil? And when he didn't die, they sent him to the island of Patmos, which is basically a barren rock in the middle of the Aegean Sea. Do you think he needed to persevere as he was at this place with no medical care and he had all of these burns on his body from the oil? Do you think John understood perseverance? I wonder if we understand perseverance. Like the martyrs of the Middle Ages who were being tracked down like dogs, dragged out into the streets. Sometimes they were hung, sometimes they were burned, sometimes whatever. There was a lot of persecution during different times of Christian history. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance. How many of you pursue perseverance? Think about that. Remember, perseverance doesn't happen in times of ease. Perseverance doesn't happen when you're sitting on the beach drinking your lemonade. And if you think about it today, there are some people who are not persevering in their faith, and they're so willing to give their faith up and walk out of the doors of the church. The church has failed me, they say. Religion has failed me. And instead of persevering and hanging on to the faith in Jesus Christ, they walk away. Are we pursuing perseverance? What's all this emphasis on perseverance about? Why are the New Testament writers so concerned with it? Is it possible that things could be potentially so tough that perseverance is required? Will our need to persevere become more and more stringent as it gets closer to the second coming? If you check your Bibles, it seems that it's going to get harder, not easier. Sometimes we get lulled into a sense of complacency. Will the time waiting for Jesus be so long that we have to persevere? How many of you have prayed the prayer because of your own feelings of shortcomings or feelings of desperation, have said, Jesus, please come soon? Faced with a medical emergency, faced with somebody in your family who's struggling with something, and we have said, Jesus, please come soon. And he says to us, persevere till the end. So what do we persevere in? In the faith. Well, I think I've talked a little bit about that. If not here, I did in my Sabbath school class. What does it mean to persevere in the faith? It means holding on to the doctrines, holding on to the belief system that you have. You know, there are times when we doubt. There are times when we question. There are times when we wonder if the theology that we hold is accurate. What do you do then? Do you just listen to everybody else and just jettison it? Or do you get into the Bible and persevere to study to find out is this stuff true or not? Amen. Don't just throw it out. Don't just ignore it. Persevere. Maybe there should be a little more perseverance in Bible study to know and understand why we believe what we believe. You cannot persevere unless you understand. Ooh, that was one of the steps, wasn't it? Knowledge. We persevere in doctrine. We persevere in the face of persecution. And you might not be facing it now, but guess what? You won't be able to persevere unless you're preparing for that. I can't wait to get to my illustration. I can't. I'm going to start crying. And we also persevere in waiting for the promised hope that is to come. Just as the Jews of ancient Israel waited over 4,000 years for the coming of Jesus, it's been over 2,000 that we've waited. And we persevere. We do not give up the blessed hope of the second coming. We cannot give up that hope. And sometimes we get tired of it and we say, oh, is he really coming? We've been talking about this for years. And every one of you can remember back when you were younger and you thought Jesus was coming in 10 or 15 years. And you looked at the signs of the times around you and you said, Jesus is coming, and then you were sort of disappointed. And then after going through 3 or 4 or 5 of those, you pretty much wonder, is this stuff real? Is there any relevance to this? Persevere. We all need to persevere. 2 Timothy 3:10. But you followed my teaching, conduct, purpose, faith, patience, love, perseverance, persecutions, and suffering. Paul is talking to Timothy, a young protege, a young man that he was mentoring to become a leader and an elder in the church. And he said, if you're going to follow me, all of these things are going to happen to you. And you need to learn to persevere. Wow. Had you ever done a study on the word perseverance? To see how many times it's used and in the context it's used? I hadn't done it before I prepared for this sermon. I was taken aback, thinking deeply about what perseverance means in my life. And I tried to figure out, how could I illustrate this in something that's meaningful? Well, it was meaningful to me. And I saw the HBO series Band of Brothers, and then I started to search out the books behind it. I usually do this. I see a movie and I go find the books. This movie series and the book Band of Brothers, the author of the book is Stephen Ambrose, and he is a historian, primarily a World War II historian. He's written a number of books. Dr. Ballard has given me a couple, and I bought a few myself. He's written Citizen Soldier, which is one of my favorite World War II books, history books. But I want to share in my illustration a little bit about perseverance in following Easy Company. Easy Company was a company in the 101st Airborne Division that was just started in World War II. Airborne just was new in 1943 when they started their training at Toccoa, Camp Toccoa. It was part of the 501st PIV. PIV stands for Parachute Infantry Division. Yeah, it should be PID, not PIV. The 501st. One of the more famous battles that Easy Company fought in was in the Battle of the Bulge, in the little town of Bastogne. You may or may not have heard about this. Maybe you'll Google it after I'm done. But it was in December of 1944. The American forces had been pushing Hitler back and pushing Hitler back. Easy Company was they were relieved of duty. They were actually in Paris, and they were having time off. When in the Ardennes, the forest on the border of Germany and Belgium, Germany had amassed a large tank division, and they were going to try to make a run for it to the ocean. And so they pushed through the Americans who were at Bastogne, because the Americans there were reserves. They had never fought in battle before. And on December 17th, Easy Company got the call. They had fought in 4 major battles. They had been decimated. But they were one of the most highly trained parachute infantry regiments in World War II. And they got the call in Paris, France. And instead of dropping in on aircraft, they were loaded up into trucks, and they were hauled to the front in Bastogne. Bastogne was extremely important because it was the center of a large hub of highways that came in, and this was the major road that the Germans wanted to take their tanks to get through to the back of the American forces where the fuel dumps were. That was their goal, was to get to the American fuel so they could fuel their tanks. They had been running short of fuel, the Germans had been. So on December 17th, with no winter clothes, with no extra ammunition, with no real supplies, they were loaded onto trucks and they were trucked into Bastogne. And as they were being trucked in, the other division that was leaving was walking away, scared to death because of the onslaught of the Panzer divisions from Germany. As they were walking out, and Easy Company was walking in, Easy Company said, "Give us your ammunition. You're not going to use it." These men weren't persevering. And Easy Company did not know what they were getting into. The weather turned really bad on December 19th. They said it was the worst weather recorded in Europe in the last 100 years prior to this. Two major fronts collided over Bastogne, one coming down from Russia and one coming up from the Atlantic. Temperatures dropped significantly. The skies were overcast and it was cold. Did you remember I told you they had no winter gear? These men were sent to the front with no provisions, no winter gear. And they were told to dig in. And they're digging foxholes in frozen ground. By December 20th, the Germans started to attack Bastogne and had it surrounded. Easy Company, and there were two other companies from the 101st, were in Bastogne. They were cut off from outside. The skies were overcast, and they couldn't drop supplies in for a few days. They finally did, but they had no way to remove their wounded. They had no way to resupply other than what was dropped in by airplane. And they were outnumbered 5-1 by the Germans. They had almost no artillery and no tanks. All they had were men with small arms, defending against a Panzer division that was circling them. You know what perseverance meant for them? To spend 28 days dug into frozen foxholes with no ammunition and attempting to hold off the German army for 28 days. How do you think they felt? First of all, I'm going to suggest that they were really glad that they had knowledge about warfare and that they had been trained. I think that they had faith that their government, the United States Army, was going to come and rescue them. You see how these stair steps you can't persevere without some of these basics being in place. I'm going to share a quote here in just a second. Let me keep going. Low on ammunition, food, cold weather gear, medical supplies, and senior leadership. Because most of the senior leadership had been off just like Easy Company, and they couldn't get back in time before the city was surrounded. From December 19th, 1944 to January 18th, 1945, they were dug into these cold, without provisions, they were freezing to death. How many of you think they could light a fire? No, the Germans were waiting for them to light fires because then they'd shoot them. They knew where to lock their artillery on. Every night, the Germans were firing what were called starbursts, and they would blow up the trees. They didn't really want to hit the ground because when they exploded the trees, splinters of these trees shot all over and did more damage than if the bomb actually landed on the ground. And so all of this is portrayed in the video, in the movie, HBO series Band of Brothers. So if you actually want to see a graphic, go and rent it. It's hard to watch because these guys were enduring an awful lot. And the other thing that had to happen was that the Germans were trying to get into the city, and they had to constantly keep shifting the troops because they barely had enough to cover the city. If Germany would have come at them from multiple directions, they would have overrun the city. But they kept coming in from one way, and the troops inside the circle of the city of Bastogne would just keep moving, and they would stop the Germans, and then they would move and stop the Germans. Perseverance through cold. through enemy fire, through lack of food, lack of medical supplies. Guys were being wounded and they couldn't take them off the front line, so they stood out there and they stayed in their foxholes with their wounds. Do you think that they could have persevered without faith? I don't. Can you persevere without faith? How about moral excellence or virtue? Do you think they could have continued on persevering unless they had moral excellence or virtue? I'm going to share a quote from Stephen Ambrose's book, Citizen Soldiers. It's found in the very last chapter, the very last sentence. And he said this about the Americans in World War II. He said, at the core, the American citizen soldier knew the difference between right and wrong, and they didn't want to live in a world in which wrong prevailed. Is that moral excellence? They knew the difference between right and wrong. And these men who sat in those foxholes knew that they weren't going to let the world be driven and controlled by someone who was in the wrong. That's moral virtue. And if they didn't have it, they would not have stayed in those foxholes. Did it require knowledge for them to have the perseverance to stay there? Did they have to understand battlefield tactics? Did they have to trust the men around them? Did they have to know all the training that they had? Absolutely. All of that was important. All of these things are important. And as we look at 2 Peter 1:9, and he lists these things for the Christian, are these important for us if we're going to persevere? And there will come a time when you will need to persevere. If not now, there will come a time in your Christian walk where you will need to struggle and you will need to persevere. Maybe temptations are overwhelming you. Maybe doubt, maybe fear. That generation is gone. You know that? Do you know what we call that generation? You know what historians call that generation? The Great Generation. Because they stood up for what they believed in. And the men who fought in the battlefields in Europe or in Asia weren't professional soldiers, and they weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting for what they believed was right. Did it require self-control to be on those lines? How much self-control does it require for you to sit in a foxhole when the temperatures are dropping to minus 20, minus 25 at night, and you don't have winter clothes, and your feet are freezing, and your fingers are freezing, and you can't light a fire? Does that require self-control? That doesn't happen overnight. These men had been through multiple battles, and they had been through extensive training to prepare them for these difficulties. But without that, they could not have exhibited self-control. In Revelation 2:25, Jesus says to the church of Philadelphia, "Nevertheless, what you have, hold fast until I come." That was the message that these men, an easy company, about the 101st Airborne, they held fast until their rescuers came. Now for them, it was General George Patton, but for us, it's the King of the universe, and his name is Jesus. Hold fast and persevere until he comes.